Let's begin with something personal, not dramatic, not dangerous, just uncomfortable. Imagine being judged every day, not by what you say or how you act, but by what grows on your skin. Now imagine that you live in a society where any visible hair, except what's on your head, was considered a kind of moral failure, a sign of poor discipline, weakness, wildness. Welcome to ancient Greece, where the quest for beauty didn't just include muscles, sandals and marble oil baths. It also included obsessive, painful and extremely public rituals of hair removal. From the 6th century BCE through the Hellenistic period, ancient Greek ideals of the body were shaped not only by philosophy and athletics, but by smoothness. The perfect citizen, especially the male citizen, was hairless. Not completely, just carefully groomed, carefully plucked, carefully controlled. It wasn't just an aesthetic preference, it was a worldview. Hair, especially pubic hair, armpit hair, leg hair, was seen as something animalistic, something you had to rise above, something you burned off, literally, to prove you were civilized. And if that sounds extreme, it was, especially if you were young. Greek boys were taught from a very early age that hair was a problem. Too much hair, you were considered crude, barbaric, Eastern. Too little, you were mocked as effeminate. There was a perfect balance, a very narrow zone of acceptable appearance, and that zone was constantly policed. So how did they manage it? They plucked, they scraped, they burned. Yes, burn. One of the most common methods of hair removal in ancient Greece involved burning off hair with a heated mixture of resin and ash. It was called silathron. Imagine a paste of crushed tree sap and sand, heated in a clay dish until bubbling, then dabbed on the skin, where it would harden slightly and then be ripped away. And if that didn't remove everything, you could follow it with a bronze razor sharpened over a flame, or a strigil, a curved scraping tool used by athletes, originally for oil and sweat, but later adopted for hair too. It was a process. It was time-consuming, and it hurt. But the point wasn't just hygiene, it was status. In Greek society, how you managed your body hair marked your class, your character, and your culture. Free men were expected to remove hair from the chest, back, and groin. Their bodies were to be visible, clean, sculpted. Think the ideal male nude statue, polished, godlike, perfectly smooth. Foreigners, especially Persians and Egyptians, were mocked for being too hairy or not hairy enough. Greek authors frequently ridiculed what they saw as excessive grooming in the East, while quietly copying the same practices back home. This contradiction between mockery and obsession ran deep. To be truly Greek was to strike a balance. To be visibly disciplined, but not vain. To control your hair, but not spend too much time on it. To be natural, but not too natural. And here's where it gets even stranger. Hair wasn't just about beauty, it was about philosophy. In some schools of thought, particularly among the Pythagoreans, hair was seen as a waste product, a leftover. Something the body expelled that symbolized disorder, chaos, and decay. Clean skin, pure soul. So in the bathhouses and palestras of ancient Athens, men didn't just strip naked to wrestle or bathe. They stripped down to conform. The smooth body became a kind of moral sculpture, a statement of control, moderation, and harmony. And like all ideals, it came with consequences. Boys too young for full beards were sometimes shamed if they showed early signs of chest hair. Men who neglected their grooming could be accused of laziness, or worse, of being foreign. And women, well, that's another story. Because for women, the pressure to remove hair was just as intense, but with an entirely different set of rules. Some were expected to be completely hairless. Others were praised for being lightly fuzzed, like peach skin. Still others were mocked for shaving too much, a sign of sexual boldness. There was no right answer, only judgment, only pressure, only heat. So we begin our story, not with a war or a law, but with a pot of boiling resin, a bronze razor, and a burning question: why did body hair become so dangerous? And what does it say about the ancient Greek mind that they tried to scrape it all away? We'll explore the answers in the next section. But for now, know this. The story of hair in ancient Greece isn't just about grooming, it's about control. The control of bodies, of identity, of who belonged and who didn't. And sometimes, that control came at the cost of burned skin, scarred egos, and a society obsessed with the surface. So here's something ancient Greek society didn't always admit out loud. Smoothness wasn't just about beauty, it was about class. The ideal male body, a hairless, polished sculpture of a man, was not something every citizen could afford to be. You needed time, you needed tools, you needed privacy, and often you needed help. Removing body hair, after all, wasn't a quick rinse at the fountain. It was a ritual, a performance, and for many, a luxury. Let's look at who had access to it. Wealthy men, especially aristocrats in Athens and Corinth, were expected to be well groomed, not just for parties or politics, but even in the gymnasium. They appeared naked in public spaces. After all, their bodies were on display. Smooth skin signaled discipline and status. These men had slaves or servants to help prepare baths, mix depilatory pastes, heat tools, or even assist with applications. There are written accounts of aristocrats being massaged, oiled, and scraped as part of their grooming routine. This wasn't seen as excessive. It was considered civilized. But for the average citizen, that level of ritual was harder to maintain. You might not have access to the best tools. You might not have time to pluck every hair before heading off to sell grain or build ships. Still, the pressure remained. Even among the working class, smoothness signaled that you were striving, that you were respectable, clean, controllable. Hair was still coded as barbaric, especially on the arms, legs, chest, or groin, so men found simpler ways to conform. They used scraping stones, basic razors, or homemade mixtures made from clay and vinegar. Some even used pumice, but make no mistake, there was a difference between acceptable roughness and socially punished disorder. Too hairy, people noticed. You might be mocked in public poetry, lampooned in comic plays, or gossiped about in the gymnasia. The lines were blurry, but they were there. Now here's where things get even more layered. Among the truly elite, smoothness was only part of the performance. You also had to look like you didn't try too hard. A man who appeared too preoccupied with grooming, who was seen constantly checking his appearance or over-polishing his body, was sometimes ridiculed as effeminate or vain. In fact, some elite philosophers like Plato and Xenophon criticized excessive grooming. They argued it distracted from virtue and intellect. So Greek aristocrats had to perform a kind of subtle theater. They had to look smooth and composed, but never too smooth, never vain, never obvious. This created an awkward paradox. The more elite you were, the more perfectly groomed you had to be, but the more effortlessly you had to make it look. So a working man with rough skin and a bit of hair could still be masculine. But a wealthy man with too much oil, too much wax, too much time in the mirror, that was suspicious. And here's where slaves entered the conversation. Much of this grooming culture depended on enslaved labor. It was often slaves, especially young boys, who heated the tools, applied the pastes, and helped their masters bathe. They were the invisible hands behind the smooth surfaces of Athenian life. But ironically, slaves themselves were sometimes expected to remain hairy, especially male slaves. Their visible roughness reinforced the class divide. Smooth skin was a luxury of the free. There were exceptions. High-status courtesans, male attendants, or those who worked closely with elite clients might also be expected to remain well-groomed. But even then, their smoothness was borrowed status, not their own. The distinction was cruel but clear. Smoothness meant superiority, only if you owned it. Now let's turn to women briefly. We'll explore this fully in a later section. Greek women, especially upper-class wives, were often expected to remove body hair as part of bridal preparation. But after marriage, the standards were less rigid, unless they were entertainers or courtesans. In brothels or symposia, the smoothness of a woman's body was part of her role. She was expected to perform perfection, while the wives of philosophers could live a little rougher in private. It was another case of double standards carved in marble. So what does all this tell us? That in ancient Greece, smoothness wasn't about hygiene, it wasn't about health. It was about social coding. A well-groomed body was a billboard. It broadcasted who you were, how much time you had, and who might be grooming you. It told people whether you were free, whether you were wealthy, whether you belonged, and if you couldn't meet the standard, you might still scrape by, but you'd never be polished. You'd never be ideal, because smoothness, like most things in the ancient world, was never really about hair. It was about power. By now you might be wondering, if Greek society cared this much about smoothness, what did the philosophers think? These were the men who questioned everything, from geometry and government to love and the meaning of shadows. Surely they didn't waste time scraping their skin. And Darren, well, not quite. Because in ancient Greece, even philosophers bathed, and bathing in Greek society wasn't just about getting clean. It was a performance, a ritual, and like everything else, it involved body hair. Let's step into a gymnasium, a combination of training ground, social club, classroom, and spa. Here men trained naked, not in loincloths, not in tunics, completely nude. They exercised, wrestled, and debated in the open air, while also undergoing strict personal maintenance. The most iconic part of this ritual, the strigil, a curved bronze tool used to scrape the skin clean. After a workout, men would rub themselves with olive oil, sometimes mixed with sand or herbs, and then scrape the mixture off. The strigil removed sweat, dirt, oil, and dead skin, leaving the body smooth and polished. Or, at least, that was the goal. But this wasn't just skincare, it was a moral act. The strigil became a symbol of discipline. A citizen who maintained his body was showing that he could maintain his mind. Clean skin reflected a clean spirit, and this idea, this intertwining of physical and mental virtue, was everywhere. Plato, Socrates, Xenophon, and others debated in the gymnasia. They weren't above it. They were in it. They walked the same paths, sat on the same benches, talked politics and philosophy, while young men scrubbed their limbs with oil and scraping tools. And yes, some philosophers criticized the obsession. Plato warned against excessive grooming. Others feared that too much attention to appearance led to vanity, indulgence, and effeminacy. But very few actually rejected it. Instead, they redefined it. They argued that proper grooming was part of a balanced life. Too much made you weak. Too little made you uncivilized. The perfect man, they believed, was moderate in all things. He exercised, but didn't preen. He bathed, but didn't perfume. He scraped his skin, but only just enough. And always, he removed unnecessary hair, because it was a sign of restraint, harmony, and control. Even Aristotle, no stranger to introspection, spoke of the body as a political entity. If a man couldn't master his flesh, how could he master his city? So yes, even the thinkers oiled up. And even more interesting, athletes and philosophers often overlapped. Many famous intellectuals had trained as athletes. Many athletes studied music and philosophy. The ideal Greek man wasn't a specialist. He was a composite, strong, thoughtful, beautiful, disciplined, hairless but not vain, lean but not obsessive. In fact, it's hard to separate ancient Greek ideas of wisdom from their ideas of beauty. The two were wrapped together in a soft spiral, like a scroll and a body, and this explains why so many gymnasia were also schools. You didn't just train your arms, you trained your argument. You debated while resting between matches. You composed verses while rubbing oil into your shoulders. And always, someone was watching, because the gymnasium wasn't private, it was public. Young men were observed, evaluated, judged, not just for strength or ideas, but for how they carried themselves. Were they clean? Were they smooth? Did they scrape too much? Did they scrape too little? The strigil, over time, became more than a tool. It became a mirror, a test, an identity check, and its symbolism didn't stop at skin. In many vase paintings, we see men holding strigils, not using them, just holding them, as if the tool alone proved their virtue. It's the ancient equivalent of carrying a yoga mat and never actually stretching. But this isn't mockery, it's revelation. The Greeks built a world where the disciplined body was a political statement, where scraped skin was a kind of silent declaration. I control myself, therefore I am worthy. And when you scraped with that strigil, you weren't just removing oil, you were removing excess, imbalance, flaws, failure. At least, that's what they told themselves. Because sometimes, no matter how many times you scraped, the imperfections stayed. And in a society obsessed with balance, that was terrifying. So next time you see a bronze statue of a perfectly smooth man, imagine the real person behind it, not a god. Not a hero, just someone who scraped his skin before debating logic, and maybe, like all of us, wondered if it was enough. So, how exactly did the ancient Greeks remove body hair? They didn't have lasers, they didn't have wax strips, and they certainly didn't have painless solutions. Instead, they had resin, fire, and a lot of very strong smells. Let's begin with the most dramatic method. Many ancient Greek men, especially those with time and money, used a heated resin paste made from pine or pitch. It was warmed over fire, then applied to the skin using cloth or fingers. Once it cooled and hardened slightly, it was ripped away. Yes, it worked. Yes, it hurt. And yes, it was considered worth it. Because the smell of pine resin and smoke became a signal. It meant you had the tools, time, and status to maintain yourself. Smoothness had a scent. Some scholars believe these resins were mixed with beeswax, herbs, or crushed seeds to soften the skin or mask the harshness. But even with additions, the experience was intense. This wasn't just grooming. This was ritualized endurance. And like all rituals, it said something about who you were. To apply this resin, men had to heat it carefully, often in small clay bowls or bronze vessels. Some used slow-burning torches to melt the paste. Others had slaves or attendants prepare the mixture while they bathed or stretched. Once ready, it was applied in sections: chest, arms, back, and even thighs. But never too much at once. That was dangerous. There are no graphic descriptions of pain, but we know from later Roman sources that this method remained popular for centuries. Some poets even mocked it, describing the men who did it as delicate, overly polished. But they still did it, because in elite circles, smoothness was expected. And where did the resin come from? Often it was harvested from pine forests, boiled down and sold in small jars. Resin merchants appeared at markets, and like perfumes or oils, there were better and worse brands. Poorer men might use thick, unrefined resin, blackened and sticky. The rich used filtered pine paste, sometimes scented with mint or saffron. So even in the act of burning off hair, the class came through, and not everyone could use resin. Some men had sensitive skin, others lacked the space or privacy. Still others preferred the strigil, or used pumice stones to wear hair down gradually. But for aristocrats, the smell of resin and beeswax became something like a calling card. You knew who was using it. You could smell it in the steam baths. You could see it in the polished chest, the perfect arms, the lack of any wildness. And here's where things turn symbolic. Fire, in Greek thought, wasn't just heat, it was purification. It was used in temples, rituals, and sacrifices. To burn something away was to cleanse it, to destroy disorder. So when men burned resin and used it on their bodies, they weren't just scraping or plucking. They were removing chaos. Symbolically, they were sacrificing their wildness for order. A smooth body meant that the fire had done its job. The man had chosen reason over nature. It's an eerie thought that pain and scent and ash were used not just to shape the body, but to shape the self. And it wasn't only men. Some women, particularly entertainers, dancers or hetero courtesans, also used resin methods to maintain smoothness. For them, the smell was even more important. It had to be masked, softened, paired with perfume. Smoothness was their performance. But it was also their livelihood, because if you were expected to embody pleasure, you couldn't appear wild. You had to appear effortless. Even if fire was behind the illusion, there's a quiet horror in that. But also a strange kind of power. The ritual made them beautiful, but it also made them seen. So what does it all mean? It means that the ancient Greeks didn't just remove body hair. They burned it. They boiled it. They scraped it off in ways that hurt, and then told themselves it meant something. It meant order. It meant virtue. It meant they weren't animals. They were citizens. Controlled, civilized, smooth, and in a strange way, the more it hurt, the more it proved they were worthy. So far we've talked about men, but ancient Greek beauty standards didn't stop there. In fact, for many women, especially young brides, body hair was treated as a problem to be solved, quietly, carefully, and with very few choices. Let's step into a marriage house in Athens, a large home tucked behind stone walls, where a family is preparing their daughter for her wedding night. She's likely a teenager, 14 or 15 years old, her groom, probably in his late 20s or older. The wedding ceremony itself was formal, involving family feasts, offerings to the gods, and a symbolic procession. But behind the scenes, something else was happening. Grooming. And it wasn't casual. Before her wedding, a young bride would be bathed, perfumed, and prepared by older women in the household, often her mother, aunts, or hired attendants. This preparation was not just for hygiene, it was symbolic. It marked a transition from girl to wife, from innocence to responsibility. And part of that process, removing body hair, we don't have direct manuals from ancient Greece telling us exactly how this was done. But from Roman sources, vase paintings, and surviving tools, we know it involved a mix of scraping, plucking, pastes, and sometimes burning resin, just like the men. Except women didn't do it publicly. They did it in silence. No one talked about it. It wasn't joked about in plays or written into philosophy. Because women's grooming wasn't seen as discipline. It was expected, and once again it was class-based. A wealthy bride might be prepared in a decorated bathhouse with scented oils and gold-trimmed mirrors. A poor bride might have only a wash basin and homemade mixtures passed down through generations. But regardless of class, the goal was the same: to appear smooth, controlled, ready, not wild, not real, not visibly scared. Because marriage, for many of these girls, wasn't a partnership. It was a duty, a transaction. Their bodies were entering another household, and they had to appear as close to the ideal as possible. And smoothness, once again, was part of that illusion. Even the gods expected it. In ancient texts, goddesses like Aphrodite are described as perfect, golden shining, untouched by blemish or hair. And mortal women were supposed to mirror that image. Quietly, painfully. Sometimes older women applied the mixtures themselves. Sometimes girls were left to do it alone. We can imagine the quiet of that room. The flickering oil lamp, the damp cloth, the smell of crushed herbs and warmed wax. We don't know what they felt, but we know they were taught to feel grateful, to believe this transformation was beautiful, even when it stung, because the pain was part of the process. It meant you were becoming something else. A wife, a figure of honor, a symbol of family pride. And once married, that expectation didn't fully end. While not all wives continued strict hair removal, many still used scraping tools, perfumed oils, or pumice on visible areas, because appearance mattered. A clean, modest wife reflected well on her husband, and a woman who let her body return to wildness. That was dangerous. Only courtesans, heterae, were allowed to be openly smooth as adults. And even then, it was performance, a form of power. For wives, it was a quiet, invisible pressure, expected but unspoken, maintained without acknowledgement. So when we talk about Greek hair removal, we're not just talking about techniques, we're talking about shame, control, and the pressure to make one's body look like it doesn't belong to you. It's worth noting that women in other ancient cultures had different expectations. In Egypt, for example, both men and women used sugar pastes. In Persia, perfumed powders. In Rome, tweezers and razors were used with far more openness. But in Greece, it was silence, ritual, a kind of soft erasure, and that's what makes it so haunting, because many of the tools used on those girls, the bronze scrapers, the resin bowls, the pumice stones, still survive in museum cases. They look elegant, timeless, beautiful, but they tell a story of transformation that wasn't always chosen. So the next time you see a Greek vase painting of a perfect woman dancing under the moonlight, remember the quiet rituals behind that image, the hours spent preparing a body to look ideal, the ceremonies of smoothness, and the silence it was wrapped in. If you were to walk through an ancient Greek temple, stone columns rising like ribs around you, olive oil lamps flickering in the shadows, you'd smell burnt offerings, crushed herbs, beeswax, and faint incense. But beneath it all, you might also smell resin, because purification wasn't only about the soul. In ancient Greece, the body, its surface, its scent, its hair, was part of how one approached the divine. To be smooth, clean, and fragrant was to be worthy. Hairlessness and holiness. Greek religion didn't operate on guilt. It wasn't confessional, and it wasn't private. It was ritualistic, it was communal, and it was deeply sensory. The gods were watching, not with moral judgment, but with aesthetic expectation. And if you wanted to present yourself before them, at a festival, in a temple, during a sacrifice, your body had to reflect order. Disheveled hair, unwashed limbs, visible stubble, these weren't minor oversights. They were signs of disharmony. In a world obsessed with cosmic balance, light and dark, chaos and cosmos, a smooth, oiled, fragrant body wasn't vanity, it was devotion. Before you enter the temple, let's imagine a sacred day. Perhaps it's the Panathenaic festival in Athens, or a ritual offering to Demeter at Eleusis. Men and women alike would begin the morning with preparations, not just putting on clothes, but preparing their bodies. They'd bathe in cold or warm water. They'd scrape away oils from the day before using a strigil. They'd apply fresh oils infused with rosemary, thyme, or myrrh, and often they'd groom. Some removed visible body hair, especially from the arms, chest, and back. Not everyone had access to resin or tools, but those who did used them carefully, because walking into sacred space with a wild animal body was seen as a kind of pollution. You were supposed to appear composed, not raw, not impulsive, not primal. The body as offering to the ancient Greeks, the gods didn't just accept burnt animal flesh or spilled wine. They watched your appearance, your posture, your scent, your effort. Even priesthood candidates were expected to reflect aesthetic standards, often smooth, perfumed, draped in white. Some even wore makeup, kohl around the eyes, powdered lead on the cheeks. This wasn't vanity, it was ceremonial. When you stood before a statue of Apollo, or Artemis or Zeus, you were in the presence of ideals, and ideals required maintenance. The smoother your skin, the more controlled your body, the closer you seemed to the divine plane. It was like erasing your mortal flaws to imitate the gods themselves. The goddesses and grooming. Let's talk about the goddesses. Aphrodite was the most obvious standard, flawless, radiant, perfumed, untouched by labor or decay. Her sacred rites often involved ritual bathing and oiling, and courtesans or dancers invoking her name were expected to maintain perfect presentation. But even non-sensual goddesses like Artemis and Hera reflected aesthetic values. Hera, the goddess of marriage, represented order through beauty. She wasn't gentle, she was regal, and she demanded appearances that upheld the dignity of marriage. Young brides would offer lockets of hair before weddings, asking for Hera's favor. In doing so, they were offering control, the beginning of being shaped. And Artemis, despite her wildness, was still idealized. Her maidens were athletic, young, luminous, never disheveled or grotesque. Even in myths where violence or shame occurs, the goddesses remain aesthetic constants. They are the smooth canvas. Mortal women must transform to match. Hair is chaos. To understand this obsession, we need to talk about what hair symbolized. Hair, especially pubic or body hair, was tied to wildness, sexual power, and untamed emotion. To leave hair visible was to imply lack of control. Worse, it suggested masculinity in the wrong places. Female body hair, especially, was seen as an intrusion. It belonged to nature, not to society. And since temples represented the most ordered spaces in Greek life, the cosmic center, the meeting place between mortal and divine, bringing your untamed body into them was seen as wrong. Hair wasn't just physical, it was symbolic chaos. Removing it, that was purification. Male ritual grooming. Men, too, engaged in grooming before religious ceremonies. Athletes offering thanks to Hermes or young men presenting tributes to Apollo often arrived polished and smooth. In some sanctuaries like that of Asclepius, the god of healing, worshippers prepared by removing body hair before sleeping inside the temple for visions. This wasn't casual, it was part of the ritual preparation. A clean body was a receptive body. A hairless body was a harmonized body. And this extended to funeral rites too. The dead were often cleansed, perfumed, and sometimes even partially groomed, so they could meet the gods in the underworld in proper form. Even in death, order mattered. Temples as performance spaces. Temples weren't just spiritual centers, they were stages. Especially during festivals, worship was performative. You weren't there to sit quietly, you were part of a procession, a public display of devotion, discipline, and beauty. Boys walked in rows, girls wore white, men wore wreaths, women bore offerings in woven baskets atop their heads. The whole experience was ritual theater, and the body, like a costume, had to be refined for the role. Imagine the effect of hundreds of smooth, scented bodies walking in rhythm toward a statue of Athena, bare arms gleaming with oil, no disorder in sight. It wasn't just worship, it was a symphony of order, and body hair would have stood out like a wrong note. Resistance and rebellion. Were there Greeks who refused? Certainly. Diogenes, the cynic philosopher, mocked grooming as vanity. He lived in a barrel and was famously hairy, filthy, and proud. But he was an outlier, and even his rebellion proved the norms he was mocking. Most Greeks didn't reject these expectations. They participated. Even those who weren't religious still followed rituals out of habit, pressure, or social advantage. And for women, refusal wasn't really an option, not unless you lived as a recluse or a servant. Invisibility was the only escape from aesthetic scrutiny. So instead, most people complied quietly. They scraped, they oiled, they removed what needed to be removed, and presented themselves to the gods with a smile. The sacred and the surface. So what do we learn from all this? That in ancient Greece, the pursuit of beauty wasn't shallow. It was spiritual, sacred, built into the architecture of worship. To cleanse your body was to honor the gods. To smooth your limbs was to respect the universe. To smell like pine, myrrh, and beeswax was to make your body a living temple. And so they burned the hair. They scraped the skin. They masked their natural selves, not out of vanity, but out of ritual, because the divine didn't want raw humanity. It wanted harmony. When we think of beauty rituals in ancient Greece, it's tempting to imagine marble statues come to life, gods and athletes, wives and courtesans, carrying out serene acts of self-care. But in reality, grooming wasn't just about beauty. It was about power and control and class. In a society obsessed with order and hierarchy, who had hair and who didn't was a visible sign of status. Smoothness wasn't merely aesthetic, it was political. Hair is a social marker. Let's begin with a simple question. What did it mean to be civilized in ancient Greece? To speak Greek, to live in a polis, to worship the Olympian gods, to have an orderly household, and critically, to present your body as disciplined. A smooth, hairless body was a body that had been refined, not only from nature, but from chaos, from the animal, from the foreign, from the poor. Body hair, by contrast, was seen as primitive. It suggested a life of labor, of sweat, of ungoverned appetites. And so the Greek elite made smoothness part of their identity. Slaves, laborers, and the hair of necessity. If you were a slave in ancient Athens, you probably didn't have the time or permission for grooming rituals. You worked long hours. You slept in shared spaces. You bathed quickly, if at all, and you kept your hair, because no one cared enough to help you remove it. This wasn't about hygiene, it was about exclusion. The elite looked at the bodies of laborers and saw sweat, coarseness, exposure to sun, and body hair. They associated it with physical work, and physical work in Greek thought was antithetical to reason. True virtue came from controlling the body, and for those with power, smoothness was a visual shorthand for that control. Who did the grooming? Now, here's a delicate irony. The wealthy didn't always groom themselves. They often had slaves do it for them. Enslaved women, in particular, were responsible for mixing oils, heating resin, scraping strigils, and maintaining their owners' appearances. Some even specialized in this, trained in hair removal, massage, or scent blending. Their own bodies remained untouched. They labored on others. Imagine the contradiction. Your hair is ignored, perhaps mocked, but your job is to remove someone else's. You work to make their skin gleam, while yours is seen as rough by design. In this way, hair became labor, and labor was kept out of sight. The foreign and the hairy, another group, targeted by Greek beauty ideals. Foreigners, in vase paintings, non-Greeks, especially Persians, Scythians, and Egyptians, are often shown with exaggerated body hair. Greek plays mocked them as bearded women or furry barbarians, hairy chests, hairy limbs, untrimmed faces. It was part of the Greek strategy to define themselves in contrast. We are smooth. They are wild. We are controlled. They are indulgent. We scrape, oil, purify. They let nature rule. Even hair texture became racialized. Thick, dark, curled hair was seen as foreign. Soft, fine, light hair was idealized because it was rare. In this way, beauty became ethnocentric. Smoothness was cultural superiority in disguise. Courtesans versus servants among women. The contrast was equally sharp. HRI, or high-status courtesans, had the time, money, and tools to maintain smooth, oiled skin. They turned grooming into art, a performance. Their entire profession relied on aesthetic control, an illusion of eternal beauty. But servants and enslaved women had no such luxury. They may have bathed, they may have scented themselves when ordered, but hair removal, rare. And that difference wasn't just visual, it created a class distinction you could see. If a woman was smooth, perfumed, and gleaming, she was elevated. If not, she was background. Even today, echoes of this persist, the assumption that polished appearance equals sign professionalism or worth. It's not new. It's Greek, male bodies, gymnasia, and class signaling. Let's talk about male smoothness. Greek male citizens, especially those of high status, often trained in the gymnasium. And the gymnasium was more than just a place to exercise. It was a public theater of the male body. You oiled yourself before training. You scraped your skin clean with a strigil after. You displayed a controlled, smooth body to others. Not everyone had access. Free citizens did. Metics, resident foreigners maybe. Slaves? Never. So when a man was seen in public with clean, smooth limbs, especially legs, chest or back, people read his class in his skin. He had leisure. He had tools. He had servants to help him. Smoothness wasn't about vanity. It was about status display. Comic mockery of the overgroomed. Now, there's a twist. While elite smoothness was admired, too much grooming could be mocked. Comic playwrights like Aristophanes often satirized men who overused perfumes, scraped excessively, or appeared too soft. These figures were portrayed as weak, foreign, or effeminate, so a balance was expected. Smoothness equals sign discipline. Over smoothness equals sign decadence. The trick was to appear naturally controlled, not obsessed. In other words, groomed, but like you weren't trying too hard. The most elite grooming, then, was invisible. Its effort erased, its tools hidden, just like the labor behind it. Tools of class. Let's pause on the tools. A bronze razor was a luxury, so was a polished strigil, so was perfumed resin or imported oils. To own these was to signal wealth, to use them without others noticing. That was true refinement. Some wealthier homes had designated grooming chambers. Others had slaves trained in resin heating, oil blending, and even early forms of exfoliation. Meanwhile, poor citizens, farmers, dock workers, craftsmen relied on pumice, if anything, maybe cold water, maybe rough soap. So when you stepped into a symposium or ceremony, people noticed the texture of your skin. They noticed if you glowed, if you were clean, if your arms looked like stone or shadow, and they judged accordingly. When class slipped, of course, grooming couldn't always hide class. Sometimes poor citizens scraped and oiled themselves to appear wealthy. Sometimes wealthy men avoided grooming to appear stoic or masculine. And sometimes illness, age, or poverty made appearance impossible to maintain. But these were seen as exceptions. The ideal persisted. A smooth man was successful. A smooth woman was respected. A smooth slave, if one existed, belonged to someone powerful. Even absence of hair meant presence of control. That illusion mattered more than reality. Final thought. Skin as stage. In ancient Greece, your skin was a public surface. It told people where you belonged, who owned you, what you could afford, and whether you mattered. Smoothness was a silent language, a mark of leisure, discipline, and refinement. Hair, by contrast, became shorthand for otherness, poverty, foreignness, labor, chaos. So they burned it off, scraped it, plucked it, oiled over it, not because they hated hair, but because they needed to draw lines between themselves and everyone else. And those lines, they were drawn in skin. If you were a child in ancient Greece, smoothness wasn't just something you noticed, it was something you learned, not from your parents, not directly, but from your surroundings. From the statues in the agora, from the oil-slicked athletes in the gymnasium, from the myths sung at night, and later, from your tutors and mentors, those who quietly taught you what a beautiful body was. Smoothness wasn't random, it was inherited, handed down like a story, and every Greek child in their own way absorbed it. The pedagogical gaze. Let's begin with the boys. In elite households, education wasn't just academic, it was formative, physically and morally. From age 7, boys left the women's quarters and entered the male world. There they learned poetry, music, military training, and how to move their bodies in ways that reflected harmony, control, and poise. The gymnasium wasn't just for exercise, it was a place of observation. You watched others, others watched you. Tutors corrected not only your posture, but how you groomed. Were your limbs clean, your hair combed, your skin oiled properly? You were being shaped, quietly, but constantly. Smoothness became part of being a citizen. Imitation as instruction. Children in ancient Greece were expected to imitate the adults around them, but not just any adults, the idealized ones. This meant copying warriors in vase paintings, athletes in public races, gods in statuary, and almost all of these role models were hairless. No one said it directly, but when every heroic figure looked polished and smooth, the lesson was clear. Refined bodies are admired, and admiration leads to status. So young boys, even before shaving, began oiling their limbs. They used soft cloth to clean their arms and legs. They learned how to scrape their skin after training. They weren't shaving yet, but they were preparing for a lifetime of ritual refinement. Coming of age. The first hair puberty, however, introduced a complication. For both boys and girls, the arrival of body hair marked a sudden transformation. It was celebrated, but it was also managed. In Athens, a boy's first beard was ritually shaved and offered to Apollo. This wasn't just symbolic, it was a moment of transition. You were no longer a child, but you weren't yet a man. Your body was in flux, and grooming helped stabilize it. Teen boys began to shave more regularly, not just for hygiene, but to appear controlled. Young women too were subtly introduced to grooming, guided by mothers, older sisters, or household slaves. They were taught that discretion was beautiful, that refinement was feminine, and that certain types of hair needed to quietly disappear. Philosophy and the formation of the ideal youth. Greek philosophers often mused on the ideal body. Plato, for example, spoke of physical beauty as a gateway to the soul. Aristotle saw physical discipline as part of moral discipline. Xenophon praised self-care as a sign of noble breeding. And while none of them wrote grooming manuals, their values shaped how tutors taught young men. To be educated meant more than reading Homer. It meant embodying restraint. It meant standing, walking, sitting, and even sweating in ways that reflected order. Smoothness became visible evidence of internal discipline. If your limbs were polished, you were clearly practicing virtue. Girls, guidance and grooming behind curtains. Unlike boys, young girls in ancient Greece were educated privately, rarely in schools, rarely in public. But grooming was no less formative. A young girl's introduction to refinement happened through daily rituals, bathing, hair plaiting, the first application of scented oil, and eventually guidance on which hairs to hide, which to remove, which to leave untouched. Mothers didn't lecture, they demonstrated. They handed down cloth, tweezers or heated resin with little fanfare. There was no drama, just expectation. By the time a girl was of marriageable age, she knew what was required. A clean, sweet-smelling, discreetly smooth body, not wild, not crude, not masculine. She was becoming presentable, not only to a husband, but to the gods. Public festivals, and the gaze of the polis. One of the earliest public experiences for many youths was participation in festivals. During Panathenaea, Anthesteria, or other city-wide events, young citizens marched, danced, or offered tributes in processions. And these processions weren't just cultural, they were evaluations. The city watched its next generation walk in rhythm, bodies exposed, limbs oiled, garments arranged just so. If your skin was dull, your posture weak, your grooming incomplete, you were noticed, not shamed necessarily, but quietly remembered. Smoothness was part of the pageantry, a signal that you had been raised correctly, prepared for citizenship, for womanhood, for visibility, mentorship, and the body ideal. In certain Greek city-states, especially Athens, mentorships between older men and younger boys were common, sometimes platonic, sometimes erotic, but always formative. These relationships involved not only teaching and support, but also aesthetic shaping. The mentor praised beauty, corrected grooming habits, commented on posture and dress. This wasn't vanity, it was education. And the ideal youth, Kalos, was often described in poems and graffiti as having smooth limbs, soft skin, shining hair, and perfect proportions. So the boy, in seeking approval, learned to remove what was unsightly, not in defiance of puberty, but as a refinement of it. Tools of inheritance. Just as ideals were passed down, so were the tools. In wealthier homes, a boy might inherit his father's razor, a girl might receive her mother's cloths, oils, or combs. These were not dramatic gifts. They came casually, woven into routines. A soft linen used by the grandmother, a small jar of beeswax passed along, a bronze mirror, clouded with age. Each tool carried history. Each act of grooming was a repetition of family tradition, and through it, the body became not only individual, but ancestral. When youth rebels, of course, not every child complied. Some boys wore their beards too early, wanting to appear older. Some girls resisted the pressure to remove or disguise themselves. But rebellion had little room. In a culture built on external harmony, the body was a mirror, and Greek society didn't appreciate a cracked reflection, so most youths complied. Some quietly, some proudly, some without understanding why. They simply knew smoothness brought praise, hair brought questions, and praise was easier to live with. Final thought. Inheriting the mirror. In ancient Greece, grooming wasn't only about attraction, it was about education, about preparing the body to be seen by family, by the city, by the gods. From childhood to adolescence, Greek youth were taught to curate themselves, not just in speech or movement, but in skin. Smoothness wasn't simply beautiful, it was correct, expected, a sign of being well-shaped, and so generation after generation, they passed it down. The mirror, the oil, the strigil, the gaze, not just tools, but instructions, because in a world where the body was the message, you learned early how to edit it. There's a strange thing that happens when an empire dies. Its marble statues outlive it. Greece fell, of course, slowly, painfully, as all golden ages do. But the image of Greece, that smooth, oiled, perfect silhouette, didn't disappear. It simply shifted westward. By the time Roman soldiers marched across the Aegean, they brought more than armor and law. They brought curiosity, imitation, and the relentless desire to possess beauty. And what they saw on every pedestal, in every gymnasium, every scroll, every shadowy temple corner, was an idealized human body. Not just any body, a body scraped clean, oiled, gleaming, a body divorced from sweat and hair and animal texture. So Rome copied it. Smooth marble, shaved minds. The Romans shaved. They scraped with bronze and pumice and blades. They used depilatory pastes with harsh ingredients that stung and burned. They waxed. They threaded. They pulled. They considered smoothness a sign of elegance, urbanity, and cultivated manhood. In fact, Roman men considered a lack of grooming to be suspicious, barbaric even. And once again, just like the Greeks, slaves often did the work. A young servant boy might be responsible for maintaining the smooth skin of a Roman senator or poet, and in the shadows of the public baths, the scraping continued, oils, strigils, razors, more oils. The skin became a symbol of status. But here's where it gets stranger. Rome didn't just inherit Greece's obsession with smoothness, it amplified it, commodified it, and eventually forgot where it came from. What was lost, and what lingered when the Western Roman Empire fell, so did many of its habits. The world grew colder, rougher, dirtier, the public baths collapsed into ruin, oils went rancid, razors rusted, and yet the smoothness stayed. How? Not on the streets, not in public, but in paintings, in churches, in whispered ideals. You see, the early Christian world had complicated feelings about the body. It was sinful, vulnerable, tempting, and yet, in every altar painting, every stained glass window, every illuminated manuscript, the holy bodies remained clean. Christ, Mary, the angels, the saints, all airbrushed into marble. No hair, no grime, no humanity, just a whisper of that same ancient silhouette, still glowing, still impossible. The Renaissance, when skin became canvas. Fast forward to the 1400s, Italy is buzzing with rediscovery. The ruins of Rome are being excavated, Greek texts are being translated, and those statues, smooth and still and godlike, are being polished and placed in rich men's villas. And suddenly, smoothness is back in style. Artists like Michelangelo and Botticelli began painting bodies as if they'd never left the gymnasium. Hair, tamed, pubic hair, absent, muscle, idealized, skin, marble again. In Renaissance salons, intellectuals discussed Plato while their portraits were painted with oil, not the gymnasium kind, but the kind that smoothed canvas into immortality. Even philosophers revived the Greek obsession with balance, harmony, and form, and so the body was reborn, not as something gritty and mortal, but as a canvas of inherited perfection. Women, smoothness, and control. This time, though, smoothness wasn't just for men. During the Renaissance, women too were pulled into the ideal. They were painted with porcelain skin, hair hidden or tamed, features softened to myth. But the grooming wasn't always gentle. Renaissance beauty guides advised women to remove body hair with mixtures of cat dung and vinegar. Others suggested egg whites mixed with lime. Some used resins, some used fire. Pain, again, was part of the process. Smoothness wasn't just beautiful, it was obedient. A woman who groomed was not wild, not pagan, not male. She was quiet, controlled, pure. And yet, this was not new. This was just Athens reborn. The torch passed, from razor to razor, jar to jar, enlightenment, wax, and the invisible ideal. As centuries passed, grooming rituals changed names and tools, but not purpose. By the Enlightenment, men powdered their wigs, while women smoothed their arms. In France, aristocrats waxed to emulate Roman nobles. In England, books quietly reprinted Greek medical texts about skin and hair and cleanliness, but always behind the rituals lingered the ghost of the Greek statue. In the 1800s, when archaeologists unearthed ancient gymnasiums, they marveled at the tools, strigils, razors, oil jars. They recreated them, displayed them in museums, and silently, without saying it aloud, they accepted that the old gods had won. Smoothness was now civilization, Ceylon, Lan, the modern mirror. Today, we don't scrape with pumice or use pine resin, at least, not most of us. But the echo remains, from Hollywood airbrushing to beauty influencer routines, from razors marketed to 13-year-olds, to the quiet shame around body hair, the obsession endures. We're told to smooth, buff, bleach, wax, laser, conceal. We're told it's clean, professional, attractive, and when we look in the mirror and wonder where that standard came from, we rarely remember the Greek gymnasium, the Roman bath, the Renaissance salon. But they remember us, because ideals don't die. They simply change name, change tool, change packaging. The hair is gone, the gaze is not. Ceylon whispered survival. And so here we are, thousands of years later, still fighting with ourselves, our skin, and our sense of what's natural. We forget that this smoothness was once sacred, once sweaty, once scraped with pain and olive oil. We forget that once smoothness meant submission, or status, or survival, and now it's just Tuesday. Another razor in the shower, another ad for silky skin, another comment under someone's selfie. But deep down, beneath the layers of product and performance, we're still standing in the shadow of a statue, silent, smooth, and watching. There's something haunting about old rituals that never quite die. They vanish from temples, from scrolls, from textbooks, but they stay somehow, in mirrors, in magazines, in the way we prepare to meet each other. And when it comes to the ancient Greek obsession with smoothness, with scraped skin and glowing oil, with burned hair and polished stone, it didn't just vanish, it adapted. It dressed itself in new tools, new standards, new genders, and survived, a legacy we don't name. When we stand before a mirror today, razor in hand, we rarely think of Apollo. We don't think of gymnasiums and oil strigils. We don't hear the hiss of resin or feel the sting of a blade lit by fire. We think of tidiness, professionalism, being presentable, not letting yourself go. We think of what it means to be clean and what it means to be desirable. But behind all those words, buried deep in the muscle memory of our culture, is the silhouette of a marble statue, still gleaming, still watching. The mirror as temple. There's a reason beauty brands use the language of ritual. Reveal your radiance. Begin your morning ceremony. Purify, illuminate, transform. It's not just marketing. It's inheritance, because the act of grooming has always been more than hygiene. It's performance, it's aspiration, it's survival. And just as ancient Greek men scraped themselves into divinity under temple colonnades, today we do it in quieter spaces, beneath fluorescent bathroom lights or front-facing cameras. But the meaning isn't so different. We are still seeking approval, still fearing judgment, still chasing the glow, the gender spiral. And here's the twist. In ancient Greece, smoothness was mostly for men. It was their sign of youth, virtue, and ideal form. Women were simply expected to not interfere. Their beauty was assumed or enforced or passed over entirely. But today, the expectation has flipped. Women now carry the burden of smoothness, not as divine aspiration, but as baseline necessity. And men still expected to be smooth in places, chest, face, back, but now under the guise of sport, professionalism, or control. The pressure did not go away. It simply migrated from myth to mass market, from gods to gym bros, from heroic nudity to modern discomfort. Pain remains. Hair removal still hurts. It's still expensive. It's still marketed as necessary. And it still comes with judgment, visible or silent, when not done. A Greek boy in 500 BCE might have winced as the blade burned his skin. A modern girl in 2025 might wince for different reasons: time, money, shame. But the sensation, still present. Smoothness is still a ritual of pain, and pain in human culture has always been a currency, a proof that you are trying to belong. Cleanliness rebranded. In the modern world, we conflate hair with dirt. We describe shaved legs as clean. We use words like tidy, well-groomed, refined. But this is not objective truth. It's cultural residue. Ancient Greeks believed hair, especially pubic hair, was animalistic, indisciplined, and they burned it away to show control. Control over the body, over desire, over chaos. Today we may not chant those beliefs aloud, but they echo in locker rooms, in dating advice, in ads, in HR handbooks. In the shamed silence of a teen who forgot to wax before gym class, we're still burning, just more quietly. The glorified unnatural. Here's the paradox: hair is natural, grows without effort, appears in puberty, exists in mammals, and yet we glorify its absence. We sculpt ourselves to look like something we never were or never were meant to be. We use blades, lasers, acid, wax, thread, chemicals, not because hair is wrong, but because our image of beauty was built without it. An image carved 2,000 years ago by men who didn't believe beauty belonged to the real world, only to the sculpted one. Quiet choice, or is it? Some people choose smoothness, truly, they enjoy the feeling, the ritual, the clean lines, that is valid, beautiful, even. But many are not choosing, they're complying, avoiding comments, avoiding disgust, avoiding being seen as unkempt, unprofessional, unattractive, uncaring. That's not preference, that's cultural pressure masquerading as choice. The Greeks may be gone, the baths destroyed, the scrolls lost, but their values, their quiet, punishing ideals, have seeped into the water, and now we bathe in them, without knowing it. What survives is not always worth saving. We often admire what survives: temples, statues, texts, traditions. But survival is not the same as virtue. Some ideals last because they're useful to power, because they create insecurity, because they sell something. And the idea of the perfectly smooth, ever-groomed, ever-youthful body, it survives because it never lets us rest, because it teaches us to stare at ourselves, not with awe, but with suspicion, because it trains us to see natural as unrefined, the last razor. So maybe, just maybe, the next time we reach for the blade, we pause, not to stop, not to reject grooming altogether, but to ask, whose idea of beauty am I following? Is it mine, or is it a ghost's? Because underneath the bathroom light, under the serum and toner and final sweep of the blade, we are not just grooming. We are reenacting a religion. We are honoring an idol with no face, a statue with no voice, a body that never ate, never aged, never existed. And maybe the first act of freedom, the first crack in the marble, is not to grow hair, but to see the statue and walk away from it.